President Cyril Ramaphosa has deployed the SANDF to 4 Eskom power stations that are notorious for sabotage and unplanned trips. Tutuka, Majuba, Camden and Grootvlei have recorded the highest number of alleged sabotage incidents. In fact, just recently, a contractor at Eskom was arrested for deliberately removing a bearing drain oil plug, while 2 security guards were arrested in East London for illegally selling nearly 6,000 litres of diesel. But it's unclear if this army will be patrolling the power station's perimeter or working with Eskom to combat any kind of sabotage by its own employees and contractors. Newzroom Afrika's Govan Whittles is currently at Grootvlei power stations for us. And Govan, that particular power station has in fact lost up to 30% of its coal capacity. But is there any sign of the army this morning?
Good morning, Ayanda. No sign of the army here outside the Grootvlei power station in Mpumalanga. That's where we're joining you from this morning live. But that doesn't mean that the army is not here, that the SANDF has not been deployed. An interesting assertion or question coming from Biz Traces. That's the organization that was mandated by Eskom to conduct some investigations into the extent of sabotage. And they've questioned whether this deployment is about visibility or about effective policing from within. There are 3 ways in which the SANDF troops could be deployed to these Eskom power stations. Now, we know that the government has said that at least 10 soldiers will be deployed to each of these 4 power stations, and that gives us some insight into the manner in which they may be deployed. So we could have seen them patrolling the perimeter of the power station, perhaps inspecting the trucks that are leaving the power station to determine whether or not they're leaving with stolen goods, or inspecting the trucks that are entering the power station to determine whether the entire load is coal and not a mixture of coal and rocks as it has been found to be in the past. But the more effective ways would be the deployment of SANDF engineers to these power stations here that have been identified, the ones that have been identified as prime targets for sabotage. That's because they need the constant monitoring of the state of the system to determine whether sabotage has been conducted internally by Eskom employees or Eskom contractors who are part of the operations here. That's an interesting part, because much of the sabotage identified by Eskom's internal investigations have shown that it's often the removal of copper bars at key locations, draining oil or putting incorrect oil into units that have caused fires. And then, as you mentioned, sometimes the removal of drain plugs or bearing plugs that would eventually cause a significant damage that would further exacerbate the load shedding on the country. And then the third form of deployment would essentially be military intelligence deployed to keep an eye on the Eskom employees that are working at these power stations. An interesting revelation coming from the Deputy Minister of State Security, Zizi Kodwa, in Parliament, saying that they weren't able to vet all of the general managers at Eskom because they didn't have enough information to do so. And it's clear that South Africa's security services are keeping a closer eye on Eskom. In his political report to the ANC conference that's currently underway, President Cyril Ramaphosa stating that they have a multi-pronged approach to security at Eskom. It includes the setting up of this specialist police task force to investigate the internal sabotage, but in conjunction with that, Eskom itself is conducting its own internal investigations, and they've roped in the Hawks to help them with that probe. Sabotage clearly a big part of the problem that's leading to the worsening of load shedding stages. And though we've seen some arrests more recently of suppliers, contractors working with Eskom, in some cases security officials, what they haven't done is break the back of the syndicate, so to speak. And the Biz Traces organization says that at some power stations, such as Tutuka, they're reporting up to 10 cases of sabotage a week. It's clearly a serious problem which they haven't got a hold of just yet. And this latest deployment by the president will only seek to strengthen his hand in the perception that he is doing something about it. At conference, as delegates, they chant load shedding every time they see the national chairperson, Gwede Mantashe, on stage. She's, of course, the Minister of Energy and Minerals as well. So this is just one of the deployments, and we'll keep a close eye on this power station here to try and ascertain whether or not there is some visible deployment of the SANDF or whether or not that deployment is merely internal.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also going to be real questions, Govan, around how sustainable this actually is. For one, do we know how long the soldiers will be deployed there, given how deep the problem runs?
The timeline hasn't been specified by the Minister of Defense, but there certainly is a lot to do here, and whether or not this deployment will stick to being internal or further or get ramped up later with an additional deployment of soldiers remains to be seen. I suppose it depends on the level of traffic coming in and out of the power station. You'll take a look at it now. It's not really busy on this Sunday morning, but usually there is quite a lot of traffic, particularly as the trucks move in and out delivering coal to this coal-fired power station. So there is scope for the army to conduct more intensive work in terms of the inspection of what's going in and what's coming out. Interestingly, at Tutuka, there was a report that 1.3 billion rand worth of spares had been stolen, and the former CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, had said that they predict or have reported that sabotage cost them about 4 billion rand every year. This clearly means that there is a need to closely monitor what's going into Eskom's power stations and what's coming out of it. Eskom's already doing that through its internal mechanisms. They've got the Hawks and the police. The fact that the army is being deployed here, I suppose, sends a stronger message of the security threat that they face. But the level of detail of the army's deployment has not really been elaborated on yet by the defense minister. Safe to confirm that Eskom has received the deployment of those soldiers at these power stations as of yesterday afternoon. Again, it's the Majuba, Camden, Tutuka, and the Grootvlei power stations where they've reported the most significant reports of sabotage, and it's the ones where the Minister of Defense deemed appropriate to deploy soldiers immediately to ensure that they could slow down the sabotage, or at the very least send a message that will make those who are committing the sabotage think twice about continuing.
Absolutely. One also wonders how much it will actually cost to have the army deployed in this way versus how much we're losing if the sabotage continues unabated. I imagine all those details will be forthcoming as we continue watching the story. But for now, Govan Whittles, live to us there from just outside the Grootvlei power station in Mpumalanga. Thanks very much indeed. In other news,